we are going to celebrate, and I want to introduce very briefly Mark Madison, who has come here from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And again, many people don't know that Rachel Carson worked there about 15 years or so. And Mark is the historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their National Conservation Training Center in West Virginia. He knows more about Rachel Carson than you're ever going to believe. He also is now with the Rachel Carson Council developing an archive at the National Council Training Center of Rachel's possessions, materials, and the records of the Rachel Carson Council, because thousands of people come there to train, to go to conferences. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous site with fields and fields of pollinators, that's bees and butterflies, and wonderful, wonderful programs. And Mark is an historian. We originally met through the American Society of Environmental Historians, of which he's treasurer. So he is someone who combines incredible history, including he is the possessor of Rachel Carson's typewriter, which is on view. I hope you didn't bring it. I hope it's under lock and key in West Virginia. And so we are going to move now to celebrating Rachel Carson, the writer, the person, the advocate, and Mark Madison is going to tell you about Rachel, how she got to be Rachel and got discovered. Mark Madison, let's hear it for him. All right, come on in.
Well, it's a great pleasure to swim over here this morning from Union Station. Those of you in the back, my coat's dripping back there, so walk carefully. I really appreciate coming out here today, and I thought I'd talk a little about Carson's time in the Federal Service. In this location, at this time and place, it seems totally appropriate. Plus, it might be an area of Carson that's slightly less known. And so I did bring a few artifacts, not Carson's typewriter. When Bob told me there wasn't going to be AV here, we decided to go 19th century PowerPoint, which is basically 2 pictures and a book. So that'll be our objects for the day. But let me talk a little about Carson. Carson's 16 years, we'll give her 16 years because she was a contractor for a year, in the federal government, are an era that's mostly overlooked by historians in the rush to Silent Spring. Everybody wants to jump to the modern environmental movement and Silent Spring, but I think it might be worthwhile looking at that period, re-examining Carson's career so we can find some of the components and missing links in the transition period between the older progressive conservation movement and Carson's seminal work introducing the new environmental movement. So what I'm going to try to do with some objects is cover 16 years in 20 minutes. So we'll see how good a job I do at that. And Bob will cut me off when necessary. First, since some of you might not be as familiar with Rachel Carson as her biographer, let me give you a brief overview of her career as a civil servant. Carson had already received a BA in biology from what's now Chatham and a master's in zoology from Johns Hopkins in 1935 when she was faced in the midst of the Great Depression with supporting her family. She'd always loved writing and marine biology, and her job in the Bureau of Fisheries built upon both of these interests. The Bureau of Fisheries, founded in 1871, is actually the nation's and one of the world's oldest wildlife conservation agencies, and it was at the cutting edge in 1935. Excuse me, I caught pneumonia swimming over here. It was the cutting edge of fisheries science. The Bureau of Fisheries eventually joined the Bureau of Biological Survey in 1939 and then became my agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in 1940 and moved to the Department of Interior. Now, Carson expanded out of her exclusively marine ecosystem and rose quickly in the newly minted Fish and Wildlife Service, eventually becoming chief editor of all publications. And with the success of her popular second book, The Sea Around Us, in 1951, Carson was able to leave the lucrative field of federal service and retire in 1952, ending a symbiotic 16-year career in the federal government. 10 years after her retirement, she published a book you might have heard of called Silent Spring, and then she died of cancer 2 years later in 1964. And what I want to do briefly is look at the importance of her period in federal government service, focusing on those areas that I'm actually trained to examine. I'm a historian of science, like several of you out here. And I'm going to look at 3 areas just to focus the importance of her federal service. And the 3 areas I'd like to look at are the role of scientific patronage, the role of translating science for the public, and finally, the importance of networks of scientific collaboration. Now, patronage is something we normally think of as regards Galileo or Darwin or Isaac Newton, all of whom were actually supported by governments at the time. But Carson also was a beneficiary of the federal government largesse. She benefited from having steady employment that supported her dreams and aspirations for 16 years. For someone who loved writing and the sea, her work in the Bureau of Fisheries in the 1930s offered a unique opportunity to be paid for her passions. She rose and prospered during various reorganizations, during the Great Depression, and during the Second World War. All of this with a federal job that was itself not too taxing, no pun intended. And while Carson worked for the federal government, she also published columns regularly in the Baltimore Sun and other periodicals, and still had the spare time to write 2 full-length books about the sea. Carson was paid adequately, but not too well, which was also critical. Carson's persistent need to support her extended family meant she was always looking for freelance work, and perhaps more attuned than most to the popular science that periodicals were willing to pay for in this period of growing scientific popularization. Although patronage seems more mundane than intellectual history, clearly the need to eat drove Carson's career, interests, and opportunities. In Carson's case, we might all benefit from heeding the words of that famous historian Deep Throat, who said, "Follow the money." The other area that the federal government in the 1930s was particularly good at was translating science for the public. Carson was supported and rewarded by agency employers because she was that rarest of birds herself, someone who could translate science effectively and eloquently for the public. Carson's initial writing job for the Bureau of Fisheries was to create short radio scripts for the social media of the day and tell the public about new and interesting aspects of marine biology in a series called Romance Under the Waters, a much sexier title than the contents deserved. Carson supplemented her contractor's pay of $6.50 a day by selling off some of the same material as features for the Baltimore Sun at $20 an article. Carson's work was part of a broader New Deal attempt to use the popular radio media to explain the increasing federal role in conservation. Now, Carson was good, but not necessarily a natural at translating the conservation sciences into the public domain. One of her first assignments was to create a brochure with the evocative title, The World of Waters. Her initial draft was far too literary for a government fish pamphlet, so her editor suggested that she submit it to The Atlantic, which she did with the new title Undersea. In effect, launching her professional career in 1937, so technically this should be the 79th anniversary of her literary career. In 1936, Carson was able to parlay her writing skills into a full-time job as a junior aquatic biologist at the princely salary of $38.48 a week. Her first job as a government scientist involved studying fisheries and wildlife locally. In fact, most of Carson's story is local to this area. Studying it locally in the Chesapeake Bay region, and then publishing pamphlets and reports on her work. Throughout her career, Carson was tasked with the most difficult of literary chores, taking raw data and complicated scientific material and then translating that for the public consumption. In 1940, Carson's source material expanded as the Bureau of Fisheries was merged with the larger U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In this new domain, her area of writing expanded beyond merely the finned to include the furred and the feathered. However, Carson remained primarily a writer in spite of her scientific titles. And bureaucracies can be blind at times. Despite having written the critically well-received Under the Sea Wind in 1941, Carson's writing talents were for many years underutilized. She was editor of a magazine largely forgotten today called The Progressive Fish Culturalist, and she created a series of conservation bulletins called Food from the Sea. I have some of these here. I'd be happy to share them with anybody suffering from insomnia. But basically, we had the E.O. Wilson of our era, and we had her writing things like Food from the Sea, Fishes of the Middle West, brochures as scintillating as their title. In 1945, she was made an informational specialist, a charming title the government no longer has much use for, but a title, informational specialist, that well described her work in the last 10 years of federal government service. She remained relegated to publishing mostly finny features for Fisheries, but the following year, an opportunity arose to broaden her perspective to wildlife and transform the genre of government writing. In 1946, Carson was finally given the chance to create something on her own. 12 wildlife conservation bulletins from inception to post-production, a series she called Conservation in Action. Conservation in Action was created to explain to the public the work, the purpose, and the necessity of American wildlife conservation. She hoped it would become a new template for all future government publications. To research the series, Carson traveled across North America to see firsthand field biology, or in her words, conservation in action. The result was perhaps the best illustrated and certainly the most eloquent government conservation publication written to that time, particularly the 5 issues she wrote herself. It's kind of a fascinating document. We like it so much we've put it online. But she went around and created these documents called Conservation in Action. You have to be sure to get the last 2 words separate. She was describing in the 1940s, this is from 1946, what agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service do. And finally, she was given the freedom to be as eloquent as she could. I love each one of these had a little coda talking about wildlife refuges called The Sign of the Flying Goose. And let me just read you the last 2 sentences. She says, wild creatures like men must have a place to live, and as civilization creates cities, builds highways, and drains marshes, it takes away, little by little, the land that's suitable for wildlife. And as their space for living dwindles, the wildlife populations decline. Refuges resist this trend by saving some areas from encroachment and by preserving in them or restoring where necessary the conditions that wild things need in order to live. It's a much more eloquent mission statement than we've ever been able to come up with in the 70 years since. And she wrote it in 1946. To research the series, like I said, she traveled across the country. And she learned a lot from the refuges and hatcheries she visited, including creating some new scientific collaborators. By 1949, Carson had risen to chief editor of all agency publications, which meant all the intricacies of wildlife biology crossed her desk, most of which benefited from her ability to paint pictures with prose. It also marked the beginning of the end of her time in the service. She was already working on her bestseller, The Sea Around Us, which freed her up financially from federal and freelance work, which had kept her family afloat. At Carson's retirement in 1952, she'd enjoyed an extended apprenticeship digesting the most complex wildlife sciences of the day, and then translating it into popular science, both for the federal government, eager to justify its growing conservation mission, and for a popular press, eager to attract new readers interested in natural history. Her tripartite job description in those years of writer, naturalist, and scientist would prove critical to the creation of the new environmental perspective in nature that she presented in Silent Spring. The last area I'd like to look at is networks of scientific collaboration. Carson's time in the government put her in contact with some of the richest science of the day and also some of the most critical scientific debates of the day. Carson's marine biology books were obviously tied to her initial work with the Bureau of Fisheries, which had created the Marine Biological Laboratory at Woods Hole. It really was the premier place to learn about marine biology. So Carson was perfectly positioned to research and write those books while ensconced in the federal agency in charge of marine conservation. But with the creation of the Fish and Wildlife Service, new changes were occurring both in ecology and federal conservation that put Carson at the forefront of the new environmental movement. Patuxent Research Refuge had been established in 1936, the same year Carson was hired by the federal government. Patuxent began carrying out scientific wildlife research 4 years later in Laurel, Maryland, practically in the backyard of Carson's home in Silent Spring. In 1944, Patuxent scientists began studying the effects of DDT on mammals and birds. Carson was in daily contact with these researchers. She edited their papers. Always on the lookout for extra money, Carson pitched a story on DDT to Reader's Digest in 1945, including, among her supporting documents, a press release she'd written on DDT in that same year. It's kind of a striking press release. Once again, I work in an archive, but this is an amazing press release. Already in 1945, well before Silent Spring came out in 1962, Carson is warning about the possible damage to wildlife and humans from DDT. Reader's Digest passed, perhaps because they had tons of pages of advertisement on DDT, but Carson's curiosity and interest in the subject remained until it finally emerged in the book Silent Spring. Carson enjoyed a unique pesticide perspective in many ways. First, the work at Patuxent Research Refuge was pioneering, complex, and relatively unknown to the broader public. Carson knew the lead researcher there, Clarence Cottam, and by editing and translating Cottam's and other researchers' work into rarely read press releases, she assimilated a tremendous amount of the early data on the deleterious effects of DDT. Perhaps equally important to Carson's unique perspective is the fact that in 1945, almost all Americans, if they knew anything about DDT, had a very positive impression of the new pesticide and its brethren. Many Americans recall DDT as the weapon against disease that helped win World War II and a useful ally against mosquitoes and other crop pests after World War II. Carson's introduction to DDT, by contrast, was primarily from the fish and wildlife biologist's perspective, which perceived DDT as an unrivaled destructive agent. To these researchers, the chemical longevity and broad spectrum of this class of pesticides meant the collateral poisoning of fish, birds, and mammals, and other non-injurious insects. DDT became an icon of these non-discriminating pesticides that Carson would notoriously rename as biocides. Carson's scientific informants on DDT included an impressive range of field biologists and refuge managers she'd encountered when working on conservation in action, laboratory scientists at Patuxent Research Refuge, and a whole network of academic scientists working at land-grant university cooperative extension units who collaborated with the fish and wildlife researchers and submitted all their materials to Carson because her other job was to be in charge of the Fish and Wildlife Service library. The growing realization of wildlife scientists in the 40s and 50s that they had been lied to about DDT was something Carson never forgot or forgave, and it fueled her anger at toxins in general. Finally, something that's almost never commented on, although Bob has addressed it, is Carson reached her peak in the agency during a bitter debate about predator and rodent control, control being a euphemism for killing. Since 1885, the Fish and Wildlife Service and its predecessor agencies had played the lead federal role in controlling so-called pests and predators, primarily predators and rodents who either damaged crops or decimated game species. As an agency with roots in the Department of Agriculture and a mission to increase useful game species, this wasn't surprising. But beginning in the 1940s, a number of biologists in Carson's agency began to question the role of reducing predators and rodents in the wake of new discoveries in wildlife ecology. One of Carson's correspondents in the agency was Olaus Musil, who'd sagely noted as early as 1929 that predators actually carried out rodent control for free, so it was kind of self-defeating. He also said, "I dislike no animal because it eats," which was kind of the point. Carson, as an informational specialist, was in the middle of these debates between the scientists and the agency regarding the role of predators and rodents in the food chain, the balance of nature versus controlling nature, and game management versus wildlife management, all issues that are going to come up again in her Silent Spring. Carson's own views seem to have evolved during her time in the federal government. She became less and less comfortable with the predator and rodent killing and more supportive of of what she called biological controls. Carson gradually swung her allegiance towards a group of agency scientists petitioning to end the predator and rodent control programs. It was a theme that emerged forcefully in Silent Spring, which argued for restraint, not total control over nature, and biological, not human-made devices to keep pests at tolerable levels. She'd already addressed this issue 20 years before Silent Spring. Carson came to her epiphany much earlier than the agency, which only dropped their eradication mission in 1986 after more than a century of killing wolves and rodents and so on. Carson's growing distrust of species eradication, even the very term pest, was a critical theme in Silent Spring. Carson noted the very term pesticide was dismissive of the important role in the food chain that these creatures played. The term biocide would be more ecologically accurate. The dismissal of eradication and chemical control over species also fueled her most ardent critics, who sensed the dangers of her ideas and, as Bob noted, persist today in half-assed websites. So how to summarize Carson's life and role as a bureaucrat, the longest job she held in a very interesting life. Carson's federal career provided ample literary and scientific vistas for her to explore, while preparing her and training her to translate them for the public. Her network of scientific colleagues and their internal debates provided her the raw material and the confidence to engage in the harsh debates that came after Silent Spring. Carson also transformed her home agency and my agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service. From 1936 to 1949, Rachel Carson was the only female biologist in the agency. Today, over half of our new employees are female, and as we all know, the majority of life science undergraduates in the nation are female. I think, in part, because of Rachel Carson's example. When Carson worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, they primarily protected game species and charismatic bird species. Today, it's the agency, the primary agency, in charge of the Endangered Species Act, the most revolutionary and idealistic environmental legislation ever passed in the world, and I think a direct result of Carson's clarion call. Finally, when Carson lived, her first passion was the oceans, and at the time they enjoyed little to no protection. Today, about 700 million acres of waters and 150 million acres of lands are managed by her former agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, making Carson's former agency the largest public lands and water manager in the world. 850 million acres. We're approaching 1 billion acres of protected land for wildlife. I think Carson would be tickled by that. Now, the tendency in both religion and environmental history is to focus on the epiphany, the moment of inspiration. From St. Paul on the road to Damascus to Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring, we focus on that pivotal moment in time that changed our world, in these cases, literally. However, by examining the journey to Silent Spring, not only the destination, we might discover the frustrations and the inspirations that shaped her later works. Carson's first book that we're here to celebrate, I actually have a cheap paperback copy from the era, was Under the Sea Wind. In fact, this book is so cheap it couldn't afford the hyphen between sea and wind that the title actually deserves. Under the Sea Wind is generally regarded as Carson's weakest work. It's almost a throwback to 19th century nature writing. It's pretty anthropomorphic for the period, but it's an interesting read. I enjoy reading it. But she grew, she matured, she became a better writer after 1941. Her latter two marine biology books were both more eloquent and more scientific. No mean accomplishment combining the two. By the time of Silent Spring in 1962, a very interesting first edition I can show you guys later, has a little personal note in it. But by the time she wrote this critical book, Carson had tapped into a new stream of environmental thought, focused on new issues of human impacts on nature, the role of toxins, and the need to protect all species, that it would eventually coalesce as the modern environmental movement. Now, I'm biased, but I think accurate in suggesting that none of this would have been possible without the federal infrastructure which supported her, nurtured her, provoked her at times, and inspired her. Thank you very much for your time. Oh, okay. Do we have time for that? Or does anybody have any questions? Perfect, no questions. Unless I missed anybody. We'll turn it over to Bob's second welcome.
I think this is the third welcome. Mark, thank you so much. I'm going to have to disagree with my distinguished historian colleague only because I love old-time, old-fashioned, pure nature writing. So if you have not read Under the Sea Wind, I highly recommend it. It also fits in our themes because as Rachel was working for then the Bureau of Fisheries, she did research down at Beaufort, North Carolina. For those of you who are in the Marine Corps, it's not Beaufort, which is where Parris Island is. It's Beaufort, North Carolina. And so she was doing research for the Bureau of Fisheries, as Mark has laid out. But she also is this young woman and scientist who got interested in the sea by reading Tennyson. Remember, she grew up in western Pennsylvania outside of Pittsburgh on a small farm. Not even Lake Erie was nearby. And so with this tremendous imagination and sense of wonder, she would go out onto the beaches on the Outer Banks near the fisheries of the Fish and Wildlife Service and literally lie on the sand and listen. And she would hear electronic sounds. No, there were to the waves lapping, crabs scurrying. She would search things at night with her flashlight. And she wrote about the struggle for these creatures to survive, to evolve, and what their place in this great chain of evolutionary being was. I don't have Under the Sea Wind with me, or I would read the introduction in which, you got a copy? We interrupt this program with a brief commercial. Come on up, because I think it speaks. If you listen to the opening of this book, and we started with Chris Van Hollen talking about how we need to tell the stories, involve people who have asthma, who live in neighborhoods that are under assault, who care about their jobs. That is something that I believe comes from this understanding of the other. This small book, published in 1941, got incredibly positive critical reviews, including by William Beebe, who was the leading ornithologist and science writer of the time. However, it was published about a week before Pearl Harbor. The nation's concerns, the cost of paper, the kinds of books, did not include old-time nature writing. But in it, she tells the story of, follows three creatures. And yes, it is somewhat anthropomorphized, not totally. It begins with a creature I'll read about in a minute. You follow Skimmer and Anguilla. This is both an eel that goes to the Sargasso Sea, mackerel who has to fight off and survive predators and all these things going on in the ocean. But the book opens. Are there any birders in the room? Well, we'll have a little field trip after the conference, and we'll take you out. So this picture, Rachel, listening, lying at night and day, imagining, hearing, feeling all these things. She's on the Outer Banks at Beaufort, North Carolina. The island lay in shadows, only a little deeper than those that were swiftly stealing across the sound from the east. On its western shore, the wet sand of the narrow beach caught the same reflection of palely gleaming sky that laid a bright path across the water from island beach to horizon. Both water and sand were the color of steel, overlaid with the sheen of silver, so that it was hard to say where water ended and land began. Although it was a small island, so small that a gull might have flown across it with a score of wing beats, night had already come to its northern and eastern end. Here, the marsh grasses waded boldly out into dark water, and shadows lay thick among the low-growing cedars and yawpons. With the dusk, a strange bird came to the island from its nesting grounds on the outer banks. Its wings were pure black, and from tip to tip their spread was more than the length of a man's arm. It flew steadily and without haste across the sound, its progress as measured and as meaningful as that of the shadows, which little by little were dulling the bright water path. The bird was called Ringcops, the black skimmer. That identification with this beautiful, strange bird, this large orange beak that skims through the water and eats that way, is something that allows us, as readers, as environmentalists, as citizens, to identify both with that sense of wonder and with the other. I'll say one other word, because Terry Tempest Williams is one of the chapters in my book, Rachel Carson and Her Sisters. If you don't know Terry's work, suffice to say one of my favorite books of hers is called Finding Beauty in the Broken Places. And it weaves together a sense of mosaic. She goes to Italy, to Ravenna. She studies with masters still creating mosaics of the kind that led people to religious iconography and worship in a pre-literate age, where you could see and feel and touch and understand the history of the Bible and religion and icons. But she says that this beauty is created by tesserae. They're little pieces that are chipped and broken by the master mosaic makers. They are broken pieces. Individually, it's just a shard. Put together skillfully and seen as a whole, beauty emerges. She then cuts, segues, shifts to a time looking at prairie dogs out in Utah. They are endangered, the Utah prairie dog. There are still exemptions to the rules that allow landowners and people to kill excess prairie dogs. And this that she's looking at, there are only 10,000 of them left. And given her literary abilities, she foreshortens and takes the point of view of these prairie dogs as men with huge boots and flamethrowers and chemicals are spraying it down into their little holes. And they scurry and they die. It's harrowing. And then she spends 2 weeks atop a tower with a wooden box where she is signed up to observe prairie dogs and make notes for a field biologist who is studying prairie dogs. And she's also doing this because she was not allowed back into Utah because she had been arrested for protesting nuclear weapons and wanted to return. So she got a job sitting atop measuring the prairie dogs that had been exterminated, that had been seen as pests. And as she observed, they have little names and numbers, HWA 58, PC 32, and she can begin to understand and observe and identify them, and she becomes, shall I say, attached. This is from up in a tower for 2 weeks. She's not allowed to leave. There's a little pee hole up in the plywood while she's making notes. And one of them, named Head Wide Apart, HWA 58, little prairie dog, is one that's particularly bold. It's a female prairie dog. And when the red hawks come over and threaten the prairie dog, she stands and screams and makes little noises that helps them scatter. When the sun is setting, they all turn. Prairie dogs sort of work in unison, and somehow they communicate. By the end of the time, this prairie dog, they have little furry tears. And HWA 58 comes out as Terry's climbing down and about to leave, and actually waves goodbye. Just telling you this story, I am so moved by a woman and a prairie dog, those pests. And then she segues to a museum in New York where all the prairie dog bones are kept. and then can be studied. And she wants to know more and to understand them and not worship them, but give them the due that they, and the respect that they deserve. And so she is looking at these prairie dog bones, all kept carefully and labeled in the American Museum of Natural History. And at that time, her brother has just died. And he had also worked in the field. And so the book segues rapidly from being with the bones of prairie dogs, of those who have waved goodbye, to Rwanda, where Terry says, I was afraid to go. All I knew was, genocide and civil war, but I had to go and see. And it goes from those bones to the bones and piles and skulls that are littered and gathered in Rwanda from genocide. She ends up adopting a Rwandan child and bringing him here. But the connection, if you think, between that sense of wonder and art and the broken places that we all live with, put together into beauty, that out of the destruction of prairie dogs, we can find something that ennobles and we can learn and feel from, connected to Rwanda, the ultimate example of the other that gets slaughtered just like the prairie dogs. That work alone puts Terry, and we have other writers like her with us, into a tradition that I think is why I want to serve in the Rachel Carson Council. It's why she's so important to me, and that I want to work with all of you to extend that sense